So, Alison, there was a lot of sympathy and empathy towards the families of those that were killed and injured at Bloody Sunday when the judgment and the not guilty verdict came out. It seems to have been an awfully long road for them to walk away empty-handed. But that's just on the face of it. When we get down into what was actually said in court, this really gives clarity on the whole situation. I think the judge was in a position that, because the evidence was so flaky, really, because there's been so many lies told over so many years, so much cover-up, that he wasn't in a position to exactly say who pulled the triggers. But go and tell us, I suppose explain to us and maybe give us a bit of an idea of what the court was like that morning.
So the court was, it was Court 12 in Belfast, like I said, is the biggest court. And the reason for that was because there was such interest in this. It's been a long time from I've seen those sort of banks of cameras outside the court. There's always cameramen outside Belfast court anyway, but there'd be one or two. There was dozens. There was a lot of the English press. Clearly there's an interest in that there. There was also some international press. This is a non-jury court. In old money, we call those diplomat courts, but I suppose it's similar to your sort of special criminal court. And so the seats that are usually reserved for the jury were also then utilised by the media because the media benches were overflowing. There wasn't a single seat to be had in the public gallery. The majority of those seats were the friends, family and survivors of Bloody Sunday. But there were, I would say, maybe around a dozen people who were there from those Northern Ireland Veterans Association and supporters of Soldier F. They sat in one corner together. There were some politicians there, Colin Eastwood, who's the MP for the area, John Finucane was there, the MP for North Belfast, and there, but the majority were people who, and their solicitors, Madeleine Finucane, who have been with that family campaign group right from the very beginning. They were there with him as well in the public gallery because remember, those solicitors weren't part of these proceedings. This was the Crown versus Soldier F. So there was a lot of build up to it. When the judge came out, he did mention, so Soldier F, if you've been in that court, he is in the court. He's sitting in where a defendant would usually sit, except he's curtained off. There's a blue curtain pulled all the way around him. There's a small gap in that curtain that only the judge can see through. So the judge did say, Judge Patrick Lynch said, Soldier F has been here throughout these proceedings. I know that none of you can see it, but I can tell you he has been here every single day, and he was there. But the judge was the only person who could see him. He started by going over the prosecution case. And that was really interesting because he started then going through some of the statements that were read into evidence. And remember, this happened 53 years ago. So you're dealing with a lot of people who are no longer there. And the first sort of statement that he read through was literally a voice from the grave, that of Ivan Cooper. Ivan Cooper was a Protestant, but he was also one of the people who was behind the foundation of the Civil Rights Movement. And he had been one of the organisers of the Civil Rights March that day, along with John Hume, where Bloody Sunday had taken place back in January 1972. So he read from Ivan Cooper's statement. He said, I've actually it in front of me. He said, and this was him saying what happened on the day. He said, as I walked from the Craig and some of the paratroopers were hammering their batons on their hands, it seemed to me that the intention of the para's behaviour was to scare people from the march that afternoon. Their presence had the opposite effect. And he read through that. I was minded while I was sitting there that there was people in that court who would be solicitors and barristers who are in their 20s and 30s. And my children would learn about Bloody Sunday in history class in school now. And for them, it's history. But you're looking at, people of a certain vintage, elderly people who were the sort of friends and relatives who've been teenagers on that march. And for them, it isn't history. Do you know what I mean? For them, it's like, but Soldier F is a man in his 70s as well. So for a lot of people in the room, this is something that has, shaped their lives, and the campaign has shaped their lives. So even on 2 hours, this judgment lasted. A judge sitting without a jury in such a high-profile case clearly feels a lot of responsibility to make sure that it's as fulsome a judgment as possible. And then we got to the point where after an hour, he got up and gave everybody a bit of a break. And that had been happening throughout the trial because Soldier F had asked that he have comfort breaks every hour throughout. So this has been going on throughout the trial. And then he came back, and that was then he touched on the civilian witnesses' evidence. And And then he went on to Soldier J and Soldier H. So the whole premise of this, Soldier F did not give evidence on his behalf. He wasn't cross-examined, as is the right of a defendant. They don't have to if they don't want to. And it relied heavily on statements that Soldier G and Soldier H had made previously. Now, they were entered in what they call hearsay evidence because one of them is dead and the other one refused to come to the court.
So G is dead, I think, and H refused.
G is dead and H refused to come to the court. So their evidence was instead read into the court. And the issue with that is that the judge said, had there been a jury sitting here, I would have to have told them that they have to treat this evidence with caution, because it was shown that those statements that were provided by the soldiers, first of all, when he read them, a lot of them were, we fired at a gunman, we fired at a man who had a nail bomb landed in my feet, but it didn't explode, blah, blah, blah. And they continually made out that they were shooting at armed people. Now, we've already had the Savile inquiry, which has ruled that was complete and utter fabrication, that none of the people who were shot were armed, and a lot of them were shot in the back or when they were trying to run away. So he pointed out that these statements in many cases had been changed. They'd made one statement, went away, had a discussion, come back and then changed it to something else. And therefore, if there was a jury, you'd have to say, look, there's so many lies and inconsistencies in a statement. How do you know which part's true and which part isn't? So
did he say straight out that the soldiers lied from the beginning?
He said that they were full of they were untruthful and full of inconsistencies, and therefore a jury would have to have been warned of that. And then obviously what the prosecution were relying on was, okay, we know, and Savile has already said that these statements are full of inconsistencies, but we have civilian witnesses who can corroborate some of what's in them, and that should be enough to get it over the line. And that wasn't. And while he,
and I think those statements initially were maybe not expected to get in as evidence, but the judge allowed them in. The reason the prosecution had them there, was to place Soldier F in Glenfadda Park, where these murders and attempted murders happened.
Where the murders are taking place. And also those statements do place those three soldiers who were part of the same brick or unit in Glenfadda Park North at that time. But the issue was that they were conflicting. So they changed them several times. And then also are they even, as you said, there was an application by the defence to have those struck out, because those statements, some of the statements were originally given to the Royal Military Police. So before 1974, if a soldier had fired a weapon and seriously injured or killed someone, it was investigated by the Royal Military Police and not by the RUC. The statements that the Royal Military Police took off of soldiers were not done under caution, and they weren't done with an independent legal representative present. And in many ways, they were never meant to be used in criminal cases. The reason why the Royal Military Police were taking them was in case someone tried to sue them, basically, or for an inquest. But they were never intended to be used. And also, in a lot of cases, people were allowed to go away, get their story straight, and come back and make another statement. So they couldn't be relied on. And then there were other statements that were obviously made to the Savile inquiry, but the judge had pointed out that the Attorney General at that time had given assurances to those soldiers at that time who participated in the Savile inquiry that they couldn't incriminate themselves. So none of this evidence could be used to incriminate them. So there's a lot of issues in terms of getting a prosecution, and not least the fact that this happened 53 years ago. And the judge did quite touch on that quite heavily, because he said about the civilian witnesses, while they all came and were as truthful as they could be about what happened to them at that time, they were given evidence about something that happened to them 53 years ago, when some of them were just teenagers at the time, and in a highly charged situation. And so therefore, do you use that as corroboration? So there were so many hurdles to get over. It was clear, I suppose, within maybe an hour in, that this wasn't going to end in a conviction.
It was kind of legally clear, probably, that it was never going to end in a conviction from the very beginning. So a legal mind was able to look at it and go, there's a huge amount of obstacles here. Even if we get this evidence in, there's going to be the problem that there's lies in it, and the judges. So from that point of view, but I think the public maybe really wanted him to be found guilty of something. I mean, we know from the judgment that the judgment clearly states after these proceedings that the parachute regiment behaved appallingly. They lost the run of themselves, and they shot dead, unarmed civilians who were fleeing for their lives.
I am going to read you the judge's statement that I have never in 25 years of reporting heard anything so scathing in terms, especially when you're used to delivering a not guilty verdict. He said he was just scathing of the soldiers who were present in the bogside that day. He said, They were members of a regiment formed in 1942 at the behest of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and had a proud record in World War II. Perhaps most notably in Operation Market Garden, in the ultimately failed attempt to capture bridges over the Rhine, which would have in all likelihood have foreshortened the war if successful. Those who fought valiantly against SS Panzer divisions in 1944 have had their regiments sullied by some of their successors, shooting in the back unarmed civilians, fleeing from them in the streets of a British city. Those responsible should hang their heads in shame.
Mm.
And that was defined Soldier F not guilty. I mean, I suppose I had to obviously write an analysis of this, and my analysis was it may have been a good day for Soldier F, but it was a very bad day for the reputation of the regiment he served in. That is far from a clean bill of health.
Absolutely. I mean, he's not been sent out of court being told he's an innocent man as such, even though, you know, he's found not guilty.
I always say, and I remember when I was being taught sort of like a court reporting on law, to say there's a reason they say not guilty and they don't say innocent. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In Scotland, they used to have a verdict of not proven. I think they've now taken that out of Scottish law. But for a while in Scottish law, you could have been, you know, not guilty, guilty, or not proven. And in this case, I think it definitely falls into the sort of not proven element of that. But what I will say is when the verdict was delivered, and I'm sure that in some way, many of the Bloody Sunday families had realistic expectations as to what was going to happen, but possibly I'm sure that they hoped that maybe it would turn out a different way. But there was no shouting, there was no petulance, there was no, you know, and the same with the people who were there supporting Soldier F, you know, there was no cheering or whipping or celebrations. It was all very, very dignified. And, you know, at the very beginning, Judge Lynch actually praised the families for their dignity, knowing that some of them, people in their 80s, were travelling every day of that trial from Derry and back again, you know, a considerable journey. So in that case, and they came outside and they did make a statement. And at one stage, one of the journalists said, you know, do you see this as a failure of your campaign? And they went, no, it's because no one thought we were ever going to get here. And, you know, everything that the state did at that time was to prevent them getting there. The Widgery Tribunal, as we know, seen this as a whitewash. The fact that these statements had all been altered and done up like sort of alibis to incriminate the victims and make them look like they were the guilty parties. All of that was obstacles in their way, which in a campaign that has lasted many years. And, you know, sometimes when I report on those family campaigns in terms of an atrocity, you will find that they fracture as time goes on because people have differences of opinion and want different things. And that hasn't happened. The Bloody Sunday families are very, you know, tight unit, you know, and they support each other. And I was in the BBC earlier, and I was speaking to Tony Doherty, his father was one of those killed on Bloody Sunday. You know, and I had said, God, you know, there'd be a big sort of adrenaline dump after all that there. You'd have to worry. But it's, you know, they're supported, their property is supported, and they support each other. And Derry's a small place. You know, it's called a city, but it's not really a city and, you know, in any real terms. It's smaller than that. And you know, the people do support each other. And that, I think, you know, they didn't walk away from that yesterday, I don't think, as saying, well, we've lost that. You know, they managed to get a trial to happen that everyone said would never happen. And as I said, it's now a matter of legal record, forevermore, that the judge has said that, you know, they should hang their heads in shame. And that in itself, I think, was a vindication of their loved ones. He also said the defence is that, you know, that these people were armed. He does not believe any of that was true. Therefore, they could not have been acting in self-defence. They didn't fear for their lives. And as I said, on many occasions, people were shot in the back as they were running away.
Yeah, so that was reiterated very strongly through the court. And while the eyes of, you know, the international media was on this case, Bloody Sunday celebrated, or, well, maybe that's not the word for it, but marked the 50th anniversary some years ago, and there was a lot of attention put on it. But really after that, it sort of whittled away again. And I think that this court case, if nothing else, has reminded people of what happened that day. I was listening to Jim Ray's brother on RTE describing how really, even if they got a conviction, they weren't actually going to expect to get any jail term for F.
No.
Soldier F was going to walk free essentially with his anonymity. Would that have been the case?
And he still does have his anonymity. He has his anonymity for life. And, you know, that was spoken about when the families spoke outside. William McKinney's brother actually said, most people if they go through a trial and they're found not guilty, they come out the front doors of that court to celebrations from their friends and family. If you think of the sort of Jerry Conlon, arm aloft, coming out, get out the front door. And he says, the Soldier F will not do that. He's hid behind a curtain and he'll skulk out the back door, protected by the people who have been looking after him all this time. So, when it was said he was a man with no criminal record, he will go back to whatever life he lives in England. But he did, as you said, he was behind a curtain the whole time. He has anonymity now for life.
Well, he must have felt a little bit rattled over the past few weeks while this trial was going, because it looked as if it was kind of going in the right direction sometimes when that evidence was allowed in a way. I wonder how it would have gone in front of a jury, because we talk about diplock and special criminal courts, and there's no room for emotions, because not that judges are emotionless people, but they have to just and are trained to just deal with the law and what's in front of them. Would a jury have felt an empathy for the evidence that was given by the survivors? Would that have been enough, I wonder?
I still think that, because he did say he would have had to direct the jury not to put as much weight on those statements of J&H as the prosecution would have liked them, because of the unreliability of them. So I'm not sure you would have got a different verdict with the jury. And in some cases, you're nearly better. At times, I think defendants sometimes are nearly better with a judge, because judges don't. They work on the facts of the case and not emotions. But a jury also is instructed by the trial judge, and they would have been instructed that way. The judge in a non-jury trial has to put himself in the position of the jury, not just how would the jury interpret this evidence, but also how would the judge direct the jury to interpret this evidence. So I'm not sure it would have been much different.
He kind of has to direct himself.
He does, yeah, and it's an interesting process to watch, and they've tried to do away with them. Now there has to be, the Secretary of State has to sign it back into legislation every 2 years, and it's reviewed every 2 years. But I don't think we'll ever be done away with them. I suppose there's a weird thing that exists within our justice system that is different from what is in the South. So the Special Criminal Court obviously deals with all the gangland cases, and you report on those. And that's now what it's used for. That wasn't what it was set up for. It was set up to deal with, RA cases in the courts many years ago. But now it almost exclusively, it would deal with some dissident Republicans, but almost exclusively deals with gangland style criminality. In Northern Ireland, there has to be a terrorist link, and it doesn't have to be the defendants, don't have to be members of a paramilitary group. The victim in a murder case can be a member of a paramilitary group. So, we have issues where members of the firm, the criminal gang in Armagh, are found guilty of the murder of Malcolm McKeown, and that is a non-jury trial. And that is a non-jury trial not because of the firm, because Malcolm McKeown comes from an LVF loyalist paramilitary family. Members of the firm are also accused of being involved in the murder of a guy called Shane Whitla. But Shane Whitla's trial, when it happens, goes to trial later this year, will be in front of a jury, because there's no perceived paramilitary involvement anywhere. So
that feels totally mad to me.
Robbie Lawler will be in front of a jury. And I mean, if Robbie Lawler had been murdered a couple of miles across the border, not a mission would a jury have been asked to sit on that trial. But when that Robbie Lawler case goes to court, because there's no perceived paramilitary involvement, that will be a jury trial. And I would not like to be the jury sitting in some of those cases.
And how it's moved here, and maybe it eventually will in the North, is that, of course, the Special Criminal Court was set up to deal with cases involving terrorism and membership of illegal organisations. Yeah. But there has been this mindset which has changed firstly in Europe, and now, I mean, the Special Criminal Court is now currently running too, that a lot of this activity of organised crime is narco-terrorism.
Yeah.
And there's a new mindset with that, and it is seen as the new terrorism, basically.
Yeah, and a lot of cases, as you said, in Europe, they've changed. And I do think they're going to have to look at the legislation in Northern Ireland and extend it, because currently the Director of Public Prosecutions can only apply for a non-jury certificate if there is a perceived terrorist-linked, paramilitary-linked, and that will interfere with justice, as in interfere with the jury or interfere with witnesses. But they can't then use those for gangland style killings, which is all I'm reporting on now. We don't have, I think last year was the first year we hadn't had any security, what they call them now, security related killings, but we do have numerous gun crimes that are done at the hands of criminal gangs, and sometimes they're better armed than the fringe paramilitary groups are,
and financed. So basically, just back to the Bloody Sunday, and what next? I've heard people sort of answering this in very many ways, but what next? Is there any further legal challenges that can be made, or does Derry now need to park this event and handle it as it does with its museum, with its tours, and with its constant reminders? You don't forget the past, but you also have to move forward at some point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was talk that there could be, that the public prosecution service is looking at a sort of perjury case in relation to some of those soldiers. I think that that's unlikely to meet the test for prosecution because of what the judge said. These people were told when they were making these statements that they wouldn't be allowed to incriminate themselves or be used against them. So I would be surprised if that ended up in court. Could it be a civil case against Soldier F potentially by some of those families? Well, there could, because he wasn't. The judge didn't say you didn't do this. He just said we can't rely on the statements to say which one of you did this. So potentially that could be the case. But then there's a wider question, I suppose, about legacy in general, because we have thousands of unsolved killings. What happens to those families now? Who, well, first of all, you'll not have any soldiers in court who were accused of killing someone before 1974, because this has ruled that out. You cannot use those Royal Military Police statements in a criminal case. They're just not up to the standard. So that rules that part of it out. So I do think Sir Declan Morgan, who's in charge of the Independent Commission for the legacy body, which is now going to be responsible for investigating all unsolved killings, albeit you have to self-refer to that as a family. He was on BBC's The View this week and had been speaking just about legacy in general. And I think a lot of it is to do with what would make people feel that they had justice, albeit not judicial justice, because the time is running out to do any of this through the court. So what would make people feel that they had healing and reconciliation? I think that now the question is, I suppose, how we deal with legacy. And a lot of cases, our politicians have failed miserably in doing that because they can't agree. They can't even agree the definition of a victim. So there has been talk that you take that away from politicians and bring in someone independent. The way that they did with policing. So with policing, they brought in Chris Patton, who came up with the New Beginning in Policing, the Patton reforms, which saw the RUC become the PSNI. Do we need someone objective to come in and say, this is what needs to be done? We can't. Remember talk years ago after the Good Friday Agreement of a sort of South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I don't think that we're a mature enough society to deal with that. South Africa is a big country. This is a very small place. There are people who were involved in feud-related murders who their children could be living 3 doors down from the person who murdered their father. Are we ever going to get over that? But we do need a proper, fair mechanism where people are also represented and feel they are represented and aren't going to have to show up single-handedly. That it's properly resourced so that they can feel that their voices are being heard and they're getting the answers they need. But we are coming near the time when I do think that the chances of getting justice in her, if you say the word justice to someone, what does that mean? They believe that means you go to a court, someone gets convicted and goes to jail. I think that we're now reaching the end of that. There are still some legacy cases still to go through the courts. We don't know what will happen with them, but that anyone who is convicted, they're under the Good Friday Agreement. They do 2 years in prison of a life sentence. There's talk that that's going to be moved to 0, so they won't have to do any prison time at all. Is it really justice if you sit through, a 4-week trial, having waited decades, and the person's found guilty and they walk out the same door as you, out the front or out the back in Soldier F's case? I don't think that's particularly justice either. So it does require some grown-up decisions to be made, and are we able to do them? Well, I'm not even sure. Last night, the leader of the DUP, Gavin Robinson, tweeted that he welcomed the verdict in Soldier F, which is fine. Unionism, you would expect him to welcome it. But he accompanied that tweet with a picture of the Parachute Regiment's emblem of their flag. Now,
it's just ignorance. Hadn't obviously read the judgment or listened to it.
He couldn't have read it because if he did, he'd be embarrassed to tweet that flag and emblem, because the judge was scathing of the Parachute Regiment. He called them liars. He said they should hang their heads in shame. So he couldn't have read a word of it. But that sort of knee-jerk reaction, that populist type of politics that we see, that needs to stop. It really does, because it doesn't even consider the hurt that it causes to people, but also the bad feeling that it causes in terms of dealing with our past and dealing with legacy. Like, how do you even start? Because there's hurt on both sides. There's unsolved murders on both sides, and we need to not gloat, I think, in another person's loss. And that's probably one of the things that, today, as I sit here, a day after all of this has happened, that's my thoughts. How do we move on from this as a society in a way that means that we're not passing all our generational trauma onto our children or grandchildren? I remember a long time ago talking to someone who worked, alongside, worked in legacy, and this wee man who I would have met, and met him numerous times, and his son had been murdered, and he had a big folder, one of those big binder folders, and it was full of HET reports and legacy investigations and autopsies and preliminary inquest reports, and it all had post-it notes stuck all over, and he could take you to any page and show you this, and there was highlighters through particular lines, and this man was obsessed with this and getting justice for his son. And he'd said, and if I can't, and he didn't because he is dead now, if I can't get justice for my son has promised he'll take this on, and if he can't, his son. And I always thought that folder is like a physical symbol of our childhood generational trauma. It's like, I have all this trauma and I can't deal with it, but if I die, here, son, you take that. See, when you die, hand it to your child and tell him to take it and carry that around with him for the rest of his life. And at some stage, we need to stop that and just let the folder, that the folder becomes part of a living oral history that is still there, and you don't forget that someone died, but you have to deal with it in a completely different way. And I think that that's where we are now. I just don't know that we're grown up enough to do it. And maybe it is time to bring a sort of Chris Patton type figure in from the outside to say, so Declan Morgan's has said that he is getting about 15 referrals a week from families, and about a quarter of those are from nationalist families, even though a lot of the main nationalist victims groups don't support that process as it stands. Can it be jigged around that it can work? Yeah, well, of course it can. Anything could, but it's getting it to that point. So, yeah, that's my. It's a very depressing thing to end it on.
No, I think that folder analogy is a really good way of describing it. How generational trauma eventually has to be shelved, and it's there to take down and read and consider. But do you keep passing it on down?
No, and funny enough, and a lot of people don't, and they've managed to, they go on, they fight for justice, but they also then live very full lives. And funny, as I said earlier, I was in the BBC, and Tony Doherty was there, and he was asked that question about how, and he says, well, I have a life, he works in the health service. He says, but my father's death is in a box in my head, and I keep it there, I only have to think about Bloody Sunday when I have to think about Bloody Sunday. The rest of the time I have to have a life. And I suppose that's maybe how the majority of victims, but some couldn't even do that. Some people are just so consumed by their grief that they just, until they're in a grave next to their loved one, that's the only time they're ever going to get peace.
Human beings are all different. Well, Allison Morris, thank you very much.
No problem.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.